The human brain is so mysterious that the thrill of exploring it is almost the same as exploring the depths of the ocean. You may have heard that only 5% of the world's oceans have been explored, and the remaining 95% is still a mystery. Imagine, even in such a small percentage of the world's oceans, the creatures we encounter, the natural formations we discover, and the interesting landscapes we see are enough to stretch our imagination. And what about our brains? It is just like the oceans. No matter how much we learn about it, the unknown part is much bigger. Every day we learn something new about how the brain works. We see what we can achieve and push our limits. But what's really amazing is what happens outside of our consciousness that we're not even aware of. What goes on in our subconscious mind? The processes that govern us, that influence our thoughts and behavior, but that we cannot fully control. Such conditions often manifest themselves as psychological or neurological disorders. I've already published a video about one of these disorders, and I'm planning to share more content about them in the future, as these topics really fascinate me. Today's topic is a disorder that may surprise you when you first hear its name. You won't believe it, but the fairy tale Alice in Wonderland is actually a neurological disorder. Yes, you heard it right. But do you know why this syndrome has such a strange and interesting name? Before answering this question, let's talk briefly about what this syndrome is and who can develop it. Alice in Wonderland Syndrome is a neurological condition in which a person experiences severe distortions in their perception of size. Individuals suffering from this syndrome perceive themselves and the world around them in an unusual way. The syndrome manifests itself in 4 different ways: micropsia, macropsia, teleopsia, and pelopsia. In the micropsia type, the person feels that all the objects around them suddenly shrink and that they themselves grow like a giant. In contrast, in macropsia, the person experiences that everything around him or her grows to gigantic proportions, and he or she gets smaller and smaller. Teleopsia and pelopsia refer to distortions in distance perception. Teleopsia causes the person to see objects at a greater distance than normal, while pelopsia causes objects to be perceived closer than they actually are. The most common types of Alice in Wonderland syndrome are micropsia and macropsia. Although this syndrome can affect any age group, it is more common in children and often manifests itself at night. There are many people who experience these symptoms during childhood and report that they disappear as they grow older. If you are wondering where this interesting name comes from, we need to get to the bottom of the story. Most people have either read or at least heard of the book Alice in Wonderland. To understand why the name of the syndrome is related to this book, let's briefly recall the story. Alice chases a rabbit and finds herself in a fantastic world where she falls into a rabbit hole. In this strange world, a small door suddenly grows bigger and draws her inside, where she embarks on a fascinating journey. Everything she eats and drinks turns her into either a tiny child or a gigantic human being. She also struggles not to drown in a sea of her own tears and encounters talking cards, strange animals, and fairy tale heroes in this magical world. Written in 1865 by Carroll, this story illustrates size perception disorders such as micropsia and macropsia. Moreover, this is not a coincidence. Various sources suggest that the author Carroll also had this syndrome, and that the unusual dimensional changes in the book were inspired by his own experiences. In other words, the name of this syndrome comes directly from this story and the author's perception disorders. What is interesting is that it is not only in this story that we find this condition in literature. Gulliver's Travels, for example. You've probably heard of this book, but to remind you, let's briefly summarize the story. Dr. Gulliver is an honest and quiet man whose only desire is to live a peaceful life with his family. However, financial difficulties push him to work on ships. He travels around the world while working as a doctor on ships sailing overseas. One day, his ship sinks in the middle of a terrible storm, and Gulliver finds himself in a strange land where everything is tiny. The Lilliputians who live here find Gulliver dangerous because of his gigantic size and take him prisoner. Gulliver finally manages to escape, and in another adventure, he finds himself in a land inhabited by giants. In this story, just like in Alice in Wonderland, we can see examples of micropsia and macropsia. Interestingly, another name for Alice in Wonderland syndrome is Lilliputian hallucinations. However, it is worth noting that this condition is not a hallucination. According to studies, individuals with this syndrome have abnormal activity in the parietal lobe region of the brain, which regulates environmental perception. In other words, this syndrome is not caused by the eyes or a psychological condition. More interestingly, most of the individuals with Alice in Wonderland syndrome suffer from migraine. Even if they do not have migraines at the beginning, it has been shown that people with this syndrome develop migraines in the future. For this reason, Alice in Wonderland syndrome is also seen as a precursor to migraine. Although the syndrome itself is not dangerous, it can tell a lot about migraine. Because migraine usually manifests itself with symptoms such as visual disturbances, dizziness, vomiting, and severe headache. At this point, if we go back to Lewis Carroll, the author of Alice in Wonderland, we know that he also suffered from migraine. The interesting thing is that brain scans of individuals with this syndrome do not show any abnormal findings. However, this suggests that screening methods may be limited. Perhaps these changes only occur during attacks and then return to normal. Or maybe the changes are present all the time, but not yet detectable with current technology. Dr. Grant Liu, a researcher at the Children's Hospital of Philadelphia, explained, "Even small changes in the brain can have a huge impact, especially if this change occurs in the region of the brain that regulates the perception of size. Striking visual disturbances can occur, as we see in Alice in Wonderland syndrome." But as I mentioned earlier, thousands of studies to date have found a common thread: migraine. Therefore, if the exact cause of migraine can be understood, perhaps the mystery of this syndrome can be solved and a permanent treatment can be developed. Of course, there is also a psychological dimension to the condition. Individuals with this syndrome usually lead a normal daily life. However, most of these attacks occur in childhood and sometimes continue for years. However, most of these people are afraid to share their experiences with a specialist for fear of being labeled as mentally ill. This may be another reason why the syndrome remains a mystery. Although public awareness and understanding of the syndrome has improved over time, there is still a need for a safer system and a more positive societal perspective in order to receive professional support for mental and neurological disorders. Research shows that this syndrome is much more common than previously thought. Perhaps you or someone you know has experienced this type of perception disorder at some point in their life. If you have experienced such a situation or know someone who thinks they have, don't forget to share your experiences in the comments. See you in the next video. Take care and goodbye.